Dear members of the VDV, the Event Organisers Association, dear planners, our association today, on International Women's Day, is launching this MICE Forum. We're going to say the opening words. I'd like to thank everybody from the ITB Berlin, Dr. Martin Buck and David Roots. I'm very grateful to them for deciding to look at meetings, incentives, conventions and events, and that we have this platform at the ITB once again. I'm also delighted that we have the MICE Hub and the premiere of the official ITB MICE Night. That's really expanded our subject area, much more than other subject areas, so we're very grateful to the ITB for that. Successful events is what we're looking at today, and there'll be fascinating presentations from our speakers, and there'll also be a very interesting discussion round. Margaret Smith's already pointed this out. That will be looking at turning events into festivals, giving them that festival touch. And we'll have BITS and Prince's representatives and CeBIT, welcome to you, talking to us in that context. Dr. Christina Buttler is going to be opening up the first event. She's going to be talking to us about conservative audiences and interaction, how to get conservative audiences to participate. Hans Conrad Walter will be talking about culture. He knows that very well because he organises the Kultur Invest Congress and the Cultural Marketing Award. And we're winding up today with Mr. Event Controlling himself, Professor Hans Ruck. Because if there's one person who really knows all the ins and outs of this topic, it's really him. He's chaired the VDV Mastermind Group. And there'll be a special handout on that for our members in the very near future. Is the success of events really something you can plan? That was one of the questions we raised in the run-up to this event. I've organised rather expensive events for the last 20 years or so. I'd say from an economic point of view, no. Or certainly not an unambiguous yes. It's a little bit like in a company. Not everything you do gives rise to success, but you can really create the preconditions for that. My company, of course, needs a business plan, and so it makes sense to have a clear plan when you organise an event. At the VDV, we organise these business plans on the basis of our outstanding cooperation with national and international experts, and also from our members in our own team. So today, on International Women's Day, at the end of my introduction, I'd like to thank the most important female team players from our team. Andy Henderson, who's put the team together as ever, and certainly over the last few days and weeks has been doing a fair bit of overtime because MICE has become so much more important to the ITB. Big round of applause for Mandy, please. Doreen Biskup, my deputy. She knows a great deal more about interactivity than I do. Thank you to Doreen. Is she here? Thank you. And thank you to all of you. Thank you for being here with us today. So I hope you'll have a fascinating convention day, and I hope that you'll have an excellent and fascinating ITB 2018.
Aufmachen. Warte, jetzt nochmal, mach nochmal. Achtung, jetzt das Mikrofon auf. Vielen Dank, Bernd Fritzkes.
Thank you. Bernd Fritzkes, a round of applause for him. Thank you, Bernd. And it's easy to see from up here, there are still free seats in the second row. There's a free seat. Do come closer. Take this great seat. It's got everything you could possibly ask for. It'd be lovely if you could really take a seat. At the warm-up, I actually gave you a sneak peek of what's going to be address today. Getting knowledge through reading means that 10% stays with you. If you combine that with videos and presentations, 50% is retained, but you get 90% if you have interaction. We had one interactive round already, you remember? Don't forget to smile from time to time. It'll make you feel happy. But there's all kinds of other interactions, particularly in the event segment. It's very conservative. I've been a moderator for more than 30 years on a regular basis, and there are some events where it's quite hard to cope if somebody comes along with crazy ideas and you really have to participate. How do you manage in the run-up to the event to convince the decision makers that the moderator and the speaker can really present these interactions so that it's not just a good idea to have interaction, but it's actually part and parcel of the whole event to ensure that the information really stays with people. We have Christina Buttler with us, who studied humanities and initially worked as a freelance project manager in a pharmaceutical marketing agency where she was head of the event department. That's where she discovered her talent for organisation and developing concepts. And she's remained true to the sector ever since. She's worked in various agency posts as marketing manager of an event technology company, and today she's now active in event agency as the Director of Business Development Healthcare at MCI Deutschland. And there she deals above all with event concepts and new formats for specifically this sector. So she's exactly the one that we need today, and she specifically focuses on the medical and pharmaceutical sector and for MCI's in-house healthcare academy. The topic she's going to talk to us about now is conservative audiences and interaction. A round of applause for Dr. Christina Buttler. There she is.
Dankeschön. Hallo. Einen schönen guten Morgen.
Good morning. I'm delighted that you're all here, and I'm delighted to be here with you. We've had a brief introduction. I studied humanities, and in fact, I studied history, and it came back to me this morning because I was thinking about International Women's Day, and I wondered if I should actually change the topic and focus on International Women's Day instead. International Women's Day was very successful with what it set off to do, universal suffrage for women 5 to 6 years. And women in Germany got the vote 5 to 6 years later, but the rest didn't work so well. Half of the world seems to belong to men, not even half of the world. And that's even more pronounced in the mice world. I think we need to address that. But nonetheless, I'm not going to start talking about International Women's Day. I'm going to focus on interaction as announced and participation, event formats. We've heard so much about that. The question we're looking at is really conservative target groups and how to persuade them to participate. This came into being in dialogue with Ms. Hennischen from BDVO. We always talk a great deal about interaction and participation. The question that arises is whether this works for everybody, whether you can do this at every event and for every target group. That was the origin of this. Many of you who are here, many of the people that I encounter talking about this, tell me, well, actually, no, conservative groups aren't keen to interact. They just sit there like that chap you see on the slide, and they lean back in their chair and they want to have a flood of impressions flow across them, but they don't want to have to do anything themselves. I address the development of new kinds of events and new formats for events as well. That's my day-to-day business, and so I deal a great deal with these so-called new formats, some of which you'll be familiar with, I imagine, certainly by reading professional journals, and some of them I think are not so brand new any longer. They're classical new formats in a sense, because they're not so brand new any longer, even if they're not applied absolutely everywhere in events. But in any event, they are at least discussed. They're part of the discourse. The question is, why is this done? What's the underlying idea? And the underlying idea is interaction. These new formats very often are highly interactive. And I'd like to break down the idea of interaction, not for every single format, but as a general overview, so that you can see to what extent there is interaction underlying this. Let's take a look at the idea of speed geeking. There you meet in small groups and meet experts, meet geeks who know something about a very specific topic, and then you switch to the next group. That's a dialogue with experts. The expert status is there, but it's a small group, and that means it's possible to enter into a dialogue much more easily. And you move. You move from one geek to the next, and the idea of movement also has something to do with encounters. You find yourself standing next to somebody else in a different group constellation, and that means that dialogue is facilitated. And there's the Warp Conference. That's a kind of speed dating on professional topics. Everybody talks to everyone else. And here, once again, there's a lot of movement and therefore a high degree of encounters. So a lot of interactions. Then you have the hybrid event. If hybrid events are done properly, for me at least, that's not just communicating out to the world, but also communications coming back into the event, responding to those communications using social media, and so on and so forth. Then there's the idea of the World Cafe, small groups around tables, working themselves. And the great thing about it is that you don't just address topics in small groups, but that you move on to the next table. And from the second group, you take the results of those who worked in the previous group and address those. You pick up on those ideas and process them. So there's a great deal of interaction. And then there's the fishbowl. That's not my favourite thing. I've never actually seen this working terribly well. Nonetheless, whoever came up with this thought it was a good idea. It's the people who are quiet, who generally don't stand up and ask for the microphone, who don't want to comment. And the idea is to involve them so that they become part of the expert group. The open space format. Here again, you have small groups, a lot of movement, use of social media, an interactive focus. It's not essential to work together to come up with shared solutions. But that can be the goal, and that promotes interaction. That helps people to really engage with the topics. A bar camp is like an open space format. Here, once again, you have scope for interactions and exchange. That's the whole point. And it's a bit more than just interaction. For some of these ideas, you have the notion of participation. And if you ask me, that means more. It means really sharing one's own contents, not just raising questions that one has about particular points that one's just learnt about. The fishbowl, if it works, for example, is interesting because there's a shift in the role. There's the idea of participation, of people making their own contributions. That's certainly the case for the World Cafe, specifically for the host who stays at a specific table. And although he or she has come along as a normal participant, they take on a very different role. And the two really participatory formats are the bar camp and open space. The idea here is that the program takes shape through the opinion of the participants. In some variants, the agenda is established beforehand. In other cases, it's developed on the basis of what specifically interests participants. And then you have your own sessions. You move away from the participant role and actually take on a sort of active organizational role. That's also part and parcel of participation. So that's part of this as well. So as I said, this is what I do day in and day out, and I also develop new formats. focused on specific target groups. And the question is, why do I do that? And I don't do this all on my own. There are other people who plan this kind of concept and implement it. Why, actually? That's not the reason, if you look at this slide. Nobody in the MICE sector wants to have the participants all falling fast asleep. I'm quite happy, perhaps because it's bright and early in the morning. None of you look that way, although so far I haven't been terribly interactive. It's a real frontal sort of lecture format. So anyway, we don't want what you saw on that slide. We want interaction. Why is that? Well, you don't want your participants to fall asleep, certainly. Let's look at the other advantages. On the one hand, the idea is to convey information, to share knowledge. It makes sense not just to hear words, but also to see, and it's even better if you're interactive. Then you have a very high percentage of information that's genuinely communicated, and the knowledge is shared. It's not just a one-way street. It's not just about me providing information and the others picking up on that information. One learns from one another in a dialogue. And that means that much more stays with you. It's an interesting, a new way to work on sharing information. And I think that that increases transmission of knowledge. It increases the volume of knowledge, so to speak. Because if I just tell you something, the quantity of knowledge stays the same. It's just been transmitted. But you have added value. There is more knowledge if you enter into an exchange of ideas. Relevance to practical considerations, that's quite relevant in a sense. If you accept the idea that participants can share their own questions and their own information about their day-to-day lives, of course, it'll be much closer to actual practice. And that means you can apply it much more readily. It's not just abstract know-how, but you already have some idea of how to integrate it into your professional life. And that means it's more sustainable as well. Because if you can integrate it into your daily life, then of course you can actually pick up on these ideas. The idea also is that the participant is really at the heart of events, not just the speakers. It's really all about the people who are there and who are meeting. Interactions are more interesting. You get heightened attention. And that also helps you to stand out from the crowd. That's an important point too. People often have a lot of trouble to attract participants to their events. People say, I'll go there, or maybe I'll just have a look on the internet. And there are lots of different levels of interaction that you can play with. In order to activate participants in different ways, you can involve them. You can also ensure participant loyalty. If you look at an event that repeats over and over again, a long-term event, you can get a real core of steady participants, loyal participants who come to the event year after year. And they know that they'll find out exactly the information that they're looking for. And the icing on the cake is participatory work, which is the most intensive form on the scale of various different degrees of interaction. I was a little hesitant because it seems somewhat absurd to me, as a matter of fact, to have this kind of presentation when I'm actually talking about interaction, but I won't talk for the entire time allotted, and we'll have scope to have a more interactive session. So, there is a sense of belonging together. If you work together, you get to know each other better, and people really work on an equal footing. It's not just the expert with the expert knowledge, and the participants after all, everybody here participates and has experience and opinions. And then, of course, is the question of networking, and that's much easier if everyone's treated as an equal. So there's the question of whether interaction is something that conservative audiences will not accept. I just can't accept the answer that yes, they don't like that. They actually do like interaction and can be persuaded to interact. And the question is, what are actually conservative target groups? I don't really want to put my foot in it and upset people's sensitivities. Now, perhaps we can take a look at the target groups for interactive formats, because, in fact, when I think about interactions in new formats, I have to bear in mind who the target groups are. And I can read a lot of different studies, both German and international, and there's feedback and surveys and evaluations thereof. And what you see is that you end up looking at a participant of the near future. Now, fittingly, given that it's International Women's Day, it tends to be a woman, rather young rather than older, keen on technology, keen to participate.
Zukunft im Arbeitsleben 4.0 angekommen.
Has now arrived in work life 4.0. That's quite important, because it's quite impossible that somebody, without even blinking, will be willing to spend an hour working in his or her free time just because something comes in that's very important, and then to put the smartphone close under the computer again. Something like that would just say, no, different now. Don't need emails, don't need work, don't need to have a position on whatever might be important. I'm at a conference. That sort of conference participant is definitely a matter of the past. People have very high expectations of content, of also participation. They love connecting with others. That is one of the most important arguments why people don't look at the content on their computer, but to actually go and be somewhere in person. Well, if that's the participant of the near future, who then is the participant of so many events that I'm dealing with right now? Apart from community building and networking, which today's participants also likes, the other things don't apply. But normally, this sort of participants at many events, including business, scientific, training events, still somebody tends to be more than 50 years old, tends to be more a man, and even though the men won't like this, is more the analog person, not really into technology. Doesn't mean they haven't got a smartphone in their pocket, but they don't need to use that during the event. It's not so important. They expect to be talked to or talked at. That was one of the first slides I showed you, where somebody was leaning back in a chair and listening to what is happening. Somebody who is more into an attendance event, also very focused when it happens, high expectations of the excellence of the speakers. And something which is very different is the content expectations, which is very high. Because currently, one of the expectation factors is the name of the speaker. And unlike Work 4.0, we still have a situation right now, it's a conference, and that's my conference mode, and tomorrow it's all going to be different. And I don't think that's going to stay like this in the future. Now, I think you have a pretty good idea of what's happening now. I've decided that the current participant, that constitutes my conservative target group. So I found that conservative target group. Question is, what was that question which kept me looking for this conservative target group for so long? Ah, that's what it was. Do conservative target groups refuse interactivity? Now, I will say no, I don't think so. And I've got evidence for that as well. Because I would like to tell you about events which have been arranged, which are happening, and it's all about participant feedback. I can tell you that logically, really, you want to script the event for the target group that's actually going to attend. But in this case, the events have been scripted with a view to the future because we don't want, or they didn't want them to be repeatable, as it were. So they're set up for the young female participant, but reality makes clear that we still have just about the majority of attendees men, and more a bit over 50, close to 60. And more this part of this, what I just call the conservative target group. So let me tell you something about what exactly this means. It might become clearer. This is a format which we call content Contra. It's typical for a medical skilling event, further education for doctors. It's a visual shape given to a verbal debate where you have pros and cons, two quite contrary opinions. So you have two sides of an argument you want to look at. And in this case, you have two speakers on the stage. They're not standing at a rostrum, but they're standing in front of a touch screen. And this touch screen will simultaneously administer two groups of slides, in other words, two presentations. Now, if I have an opinion, I can express this opinion, show my slides, and if I'm the second speaker on that stage, you can say, I've got a counter-argument. And it's not just verbal, I've got the right slides for that as well to back up my view. So at the back is a big screen, which makes sure that everybody in the hall can understand the two arguments. And this is working really well. That is a visualized opinion, very clearly pronounced opinions, making the whole thing quite exciting. It's also very interactive because participants have a voting system. So they're really getting into the debate. There's a vote taken before this pro and con debate and one afterwards. So in other words, participants are involved live, and they can explain to the speakers which one of them is really important. And it's really exciting. And as I've said, this is a real-life event. The participants tend to be 50+, majority men rather than women, and very conservative, I'd say so. And this is the feedback. Not going to read it all to you. There are just a few buzzwords. One says, this is one of the best events I've attended. Clear conclusions drawn which are relevant for the practice, relevant for practical matters. That's something which people always like. 92% of participants have said they'd mark that event really, really high, 1.25 if one is the best mark. So this interactive format is really working, even with those who would traditionally be considered the more conservative target group. The speakers, the people who ran these scientific events, they tend to be even a few years older than their participants, so it's quite a change for them to adopt such a format, but they've given us a very positive feedback as well. They're saying this is, right at the top of the tree of medical further education, this lively exchange of pro-con views, that's really refreshing, very good. It is relevant for practical work, very clear, transparent. The transparency was rated highly, and that was coming out of all these events. The event at which this was done last autumn has been around for years, but this was the first time they adopted this format, and it really increased attendance. So that is the result if you can adopt a very interactive approach when dealing with a very conservative audience. Another example, Content Corner. That's a mix of everything, of all the groups that are participants at events. Here again, it was the traditional participants, the speakers, and in smaller groups they can be asked about what was presented earlier, or if there are other questions they would like to ask to one of these eminent people they have in front of them. And in this case, industry carries the event. They are financially sponsoring it. And I want to communicate with the participants. And we're doing this in this format, all with each other, mixed up with each other, everything in parallel and overlapping. So that's small groups. It's not one person standing in front talking to everybody. It's much more interactive, but everybody is free to just say, oh, well, that's a colleague I haven't seen for ages. So let us go into the corner, just have a cup of tea and eat something. So nobody will be dragged away or something like that. And obviously there is quite a lot of attendance for that. Another event where I've developed the format together with content camps is like this. You can see here this content camp idea gives you an open space, but here we have a changeover. Plenary sessions, short, concise, disseminating knowledge in one presentation, but then immediately afterwards, for the next sort of time unit, the group will separate, go into different corners of the room. And what happens there is quite exciting because it means that the participants bring their own case examples, patient studies, all the problems which they've encountered in their clinical everyday work. And they present these cases and discuss it with the other participants. And this change of role is absolutely perfect because suddenly the participant becomes the speaker and the actual expert, the traditional speaker, is the one who takes a step back and may just act a bit as a moderator if need be. So it's a clear change of roles, and it means that in this content camp we're dealing with this very new system. What I find particularly interesting here is because we change things around all the time. All these participants who actually present something of their own in this content camp, which comes from their everyday clinical experience, they've assumed a different role in this situation, and they carry that role further because they will be the very ones that will be more willing to ask questions when there is the presentation scenario again. So every time you change over, have this camp, then assume a more active role, you will be more active in the plenary part as well, because you will involve yourself, participate actively. And that's wonderful to see. It's fun, actually, to watch and see how the participant who used to be consuming the content becomes a participating attendee. So there is feedback on that sort of event format as well. The direct dialogue with the expert is highly appreciated. Again, that has to do with the relevance for clinical practice, because people can really take something home with them, something tangible. It's not just grey theory far removed from them. Here again, the speakers and the people who arrange the scientific content have to completely change the way they do this. So we say the time of preacher-type lectures is over. That's not new. We've said that for years, but we still have such presentations. But to hear about 60-year-old speakers say that is still quite encouraging. The people who run these content camps, by bringing their clinical examples, the case studies they present to others, they make it much better because there is a give and take, and that really makes the relevance to the practical work of the people involved very clear. They consider that to be quite intensive, but also interesting, because you don't want to get bored. Once you get bored, you take in much less than if you stay interested because things are exciting. So these were some of the examples of events I brought. Question is, does interaction actually always work? Does it really always work is what we're saying here, because interaction isn't the suitable format for every single kind of event. There may be some objectives you have that you won't be able to achieve going the interactive route. But if you've decided you want to do that, go interactive for a particular event, then really, with this slight proviso for really, you can actually achieve something, and interaction will then work with all different target groups. Although there are a few things to bear in mind. You have to really think the concept through. The concepts are much more work. It's much more intensive preparation to arrange an interactive event than it would be to just have a traditional type of event. It also requires communication that has to be very pronounced, very clear and sustainable, because if you have the idea for the first time, to open questions, and you want to know what the participants want to know. I ask them if they ask questions. If they apply to attend the conference, we are asking them immediately, what is it that you're particularly interested in, what do you want to say? And obviously you don't get the feedback of other people saying, that's just what I've always wanted to tell you, but you do have to keep asking them. You have to make clear what it is that you want. You have to communicate clearly to them. A second thing is then, the sort of reverse side of the medal, that's briefings for the speakers, because that's quite important. It's almost taking them by the hand in an almost literal way, because if somebody is always just given presentations, is not somebody who will be quite happy and go in his own volition to a corner of a room and hope for other people to come. Because if people don't know that content corner system, you will have to go there with them and say, there are some participants who want to ask you something. Otherwise, the people will be there, but the expert won't. So this is something which, in all my discussion about communication and briefings, is becoming clear. Perseverance is the name of the game. To communicate something once, to brief somebody once, is usually not sufficient. You have to do it more times, and you need a bit of courage to do it, particularly when we're talking about the conservative target groups. And if I'm honest, you probably need not just that little bit of courage. You need quite a lot of courage. But ultimately, that's still what I want you to have, what I wish for you. Perhaps that's something you can show when concepting your event, when realizing your event, because I think in the end, we don't want to have a sleeping audience in front of us. We want that sort of person, right? That's how they want to leave the event. Okay, that was my one-dimensional sort of typical presentation input. But I believe we still have time. If anybody wants to ask anything, please do so. And wait for the roving mics. 2 people with a mic, we race for it. Hello, thank you very much for that presentation, which I found highly interesting. And I've noticed, as you have done, first of all, changing the names is something which helps a lot with conservative target groups. The World Cafe or the Fishbowl is already a deterrent. Content camp is what you call your things and so on. It's very good. But as far as the content camps are concerned, I would like to ask you a question. How do you make sure that participants give their own little speeches? How do you start that when organizing the event? Because surely they won't do that spontaneously. So how do you manage to get participants willing to be part of this interactive idea? You are the professional and you've realized what the weak point is, because that is exactly where the crux is. Because in the very first year when we realized this event like this, we didn't do that very well. We did request participants to do this. We did it several times to bring case studies, but when the feedback wasn't sufficient, we had to apply the little trick of involving the speakers and saying that there were people they know in their circle, people who are quite appropriate, because maybe they're not quite so high up in their career that they shouldn't be given a presentation, but could be doing that. And I must be honest, the first year it only worked by getting these people sort of semi-organized before that. But the second year we didn't need that involvement of the speakers who pinpointed several people and so on. We asked people to just submit their own case examples and so on, and they did that. They did it on their own. So again, perseverance. Any other questions here in the front, please? Another question regarding the content camps. When the participants exchange views about particularly problematic case, is your objective to find solutions and to then share them with the community at large, or what is the outcome of these content camps? Yes, it is exactly as you say, although in part at least, some matters are being discussed which may no longer be unresolved, but where a participant provides a solution, but a solution which he or she thinks, well, it may be my idea, but I wonder how other people think about it. But indeed, yes, we do have a round of conclusions where we sort of sum this up and present the things, because obviously it's impossible for everybody to be involved in every single idea, because participants will have to decide which corner to choose, but they may wish to be involved in other things as well. So we do have a summary, which is then moderated by the experts who have expert knowledge in whatever particular field this is. Oh, and perhaps I should add too that it's all very unusual for the traditional type of speaker to do this, because we've taken over the fact that there is no fixed sort of setup for these groups. And if there are some people in the content corner who think, I wanted to go there, but it's not that exciting, but over in that corner, people seem to be having a lively discussion. I'll just go there, and the people are free to do so, leave. And it may mean that if somebody has a very serious, very exciting, very important issue at stake, it might still mean that the person is standing there and thinks, nobody else seems to find that very interesting. it's often very hard for the people who submit the subjects to be discussed. Any other questions? Now you've got an expert. You can ask until you're blue in the face. I can see a gentleman with glasses. I should count the steps I take here. Never mind. What is more difficult for you? To convince your clients of the new format, or to convince the speakers? Where is it most difficult to persuade people of what you're doing? I'm so pleased that a man asked me a question. I was worried that by harping on the gender issue, I frightened all the men off. No, both is quite difficult. It is quite a challenge. It's quite simple for me to convince the organizers, because we are the organizers. So I have to convince myself or my manager, director, not somebody else who may provide the funding. We only get additional event organizers on board once we have decided on the outline. And of course, for the speakers, it can say, look, it works now. It could say, it's not something which I've thought about, off the cuff, but we've done it before and it's been successful. But among the speakers, there are always some that aren't willing to go that route. It doesn't make everybody happy. So you have to choose the speakers accordingly. You have to sort of slowly, gradually sort of get them into this. Or you can say, I can still remember one of my first scientific sort of directors 3 years ago. I presented 2 different options I would like to have for the particular event that he was running, and I thought in advance, I hope he takes one of them. And he just told me after a while of listening to me, well, let's do them both. And I came home all happy and feeling exhilarated, because that was fantastic. But obviously, if you don't get any positive feedback from the speakers, from the attendees, you can let it be. But often there is something coming back to you. Because let's be honest, for the speakers, it's not all that exciting always to put your PowerPoint presentation on your computer and go and give that speech. So next time I'll do it differently too. We have now had a sort of, we've had three formats, content formats, which we've put sort of in isolation to each other. Can we also think of an overlap between them, or a mix? Certainly that might make it simpler, but is it possible to mix up some elements of these different types of formats? Yes. So first of all, quite often these formats are mixed with the typical traditional type of presentation. That's still the case. And we also mix elements of the different content formats. Since I was fortunate enough to realize the events and then furnish evidence of its success, that our customers pick up on that and use it. Under the term content camp alone, there are so many different sort of variants of the format which had to be changed because of certain wishes of our clients, that we need to think of what exactly was the content camp again. But I'm a great proponent of making sure that these formats which exist, whether we're talking Smart Camp, World Cafe, or whatever, we all should use them as ideas and take what we like from them. What matters is the principles behind them, not all the fleshed out concept in its entirety. Another question? Yes. I would like to ask a brief question regarding the content pro and con debate. How do you prepare it to speakers? Does one know what information the other one will have, or is it a completely unknown scenario? No. First of all, using that tool isn't totally self-explanatory. I mean, you have to have tried it. It's very different whether you use the tool or whether you simply, in a traditional way, have you click your way through a presentation. In addition to that, the main advantage in actually having this sort of, give and take in the debate is not something you can make happen spontaneously off the cuff. You need to get 2 people who you can say they'd be good at it, and they'll have to prepare for that. And if maybe they're talking about one of what is their standard subjects, a subject which they frequently comment on, they still have to change their presentation and adjust it to what the other guy is saying. So they have to prepare properly, and they've also got to test out the device. So if we're speaking of a one-day event, we have to make sure that we have a good speaker briefing with the original slides and the device we're using, that touch screen. One more question. Oh gosh, everybody wants to ask a question. I think I'll have to sort of avoid somebody and go to one person. Do you go to the mice as well? Yes, I'll be there. I'll be there for questions afterwards. Sorry about ignoring the others, but you were the first to have your hand up. Thanks very much. I have a question. These formats, event formats, are very different. But you must involve service providers, especially the location hosts. Do you have different expectations of that location host now than you used to have in the past? So that, I mean, I come from the other side of the equation myself, so that we, as location hosts, can sort of prepare for that and gear up to meet your challenges. If you do that, I'd be more than grateful to you, because actually that's one of the iffy points, because let's say I go to a traditional sort of conference venue and tell them how many participants I have and then tell them how much space I'd like for them. They usually can't even quote because they don't get that together. So what we actually need is more space, literally space for such formats. So we need larger rooms as well. I really, really like it when we have these content camps on the corners, if we have those in an open space part of a hall and not stuff them into a little room and close the door so nobody can leave. So yeah, we do have very different requirements for this type of event. And even though the people from the hotels and so on and the venues don't like it so much, but it actually has meant that we're going into locations rather than hotels. So here, thank you very much for Dr. Christina Buttler.